1942. The Allied plan to invade northern France. Operation Sledgehammer. Too much, too soon in a conflict still spiraling out of control at a terrifying rate, an ambitious invasion of Normandy planned for 1942 was quickly shelved. In retrospect, the battle lines of World War II seem clearly drawn, yet since its start, the situation had been subject to changes at dizzying speed. The Soviet Union had begun as an ally, however uncomfortable, of Nazi Germany. The United States had not been involved at all. France, on the other hand, had seemed the staunchest and strongest of allies. Germany's own generals appear to have feared the worst when they invaded the country. All change. What a difference the months had made. France had fallen in no time flat. Its quick collapse seems to have been the result of a wholesale failure of intelligence, not just in Paris, but in London. And then, on the 22nd of June 1941, Hitler had kicked in the door of what he saw as a ramshackle Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa had begun. The Germans had erupted into the Soviet Union with what's believed to have been the biggest fighting force ever deployed, 4.5 million men. The USSR was now fighting for its survival. For Britain, arguably, things were looking up. The Soviets were hardly friends, but they were now functioning as allies. They were certainly doing some seriously heavy lifting. Casualties were fearful on this eastern front, where Hitler's armies were engaged in a race war, attempting to clear the steppe of Slavs. If truth be told, the Soviets were losing badly, but more important from the perspective of the Western Allies, they were soaking up an enormous amount of Axis pressure. Not that the Germans were having things all their own way. Their statistics don't tell an especially happy story either. Though light by Soviet standards, their casualties were by any normal standards grim indeed. Whilst they didn't take anything like as many fatalities as the Soviets did, more than 100,000 died, and 700,000 or so were wounded. They had somehow to be carried along and cared for. No fewer than 14,000 Axis soldiers had to have limbs amputated owing to frostbite in the winter of 1941 to 1942. They became a further drag on an army that was already bogged down in hostile territory. Literally so. The invading army was just 150 kilometers, or 90 miles, from Moscow in October 1941, when its advance was stalled by the onset of the Rasputitsa, the torrential autumn rains. Regaining the initiative. By the beginning of 1942, moreover, the United States was at Britain's side. The year to come could be faced with a bit more confidence. Even so, Britain felt bloodied from its experiences at Dunkirk. It comes as no surprise, therefore, that Britain should have shown some skepticism about Sledgehammer, an operation that might easily prove as disastrous as the defeat of the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, in France. Neither, on the other hand, is it so remarkable that an up-and-atom tactic of taking the fighting to the Germans should have appealed to the can-do strategists on the US side. Though British staff scoffed at their naivety, there were good reasons for mounting an invasion of France, or even just a major raid, at this stage of the war. First, and maybe most important, Stalin was clamoring for a second front to be opened, and it was hard to deny that Soviet forces were entitled to support. Then, there was the craftier calculation. What if the Red Army's resistance crumbled? Or, for that matter, if, by some as yet inconceivable fortune, the Soviets won? Either way, it made sense for the Western Allies to take back the initiative any way they could. A positive precedent. If the British didn't instantly dismiss the idea of Sledgehammer out of hand, this was due in part to their recent success at St. Nazaire. This naval base stands on the northern banks of the Loire, where it enters the Bay of Biscay. It was vital for its dry dock facilities and its fortified U-boat pens. 3 destroyers set off with a small flotilla. One of them, HMS Campbelltown, was laden with explosive and stripped of heavy fittings to reduce her draft so that, with the help of an unusually high spring tide, she could clear the sandbanks of the estuary. She was also specially armoured round the bows. The idea was that she could be used as a battering ram to penetrate the heavy dock gates, opening the way for the motor launches and patrol boats that were carrying in all some 700 commandos. The attacking convoy was spotted as it approached, but it had the advantages of surprise and speed, and the skill and courage of the commandos, who quickly seized control and set explosives around key installations. The Campbelltown sailed right into the dry dock before the men on board abandoned ship and detonated the charges. The raid was an extraordinary success. The dry dock remained unusable until after the war. There'd been no thought of the raiders lingering, however, to establish themselves permanently in the port, and even so, it had been very costly in lives. Mixed feelings. A smash-and-grab raid on some key port would raise morale, American strategists suggested, and sent the right sort of signal to Stalin and his forces in the east. The more so if an invasion force could establish itself there for the longer term. Cherbourg or Brest might then be the bridgehead for a more sustained assault on mainland Europe, clawing back the conquests of Germany over time. The British couldn't feel quite so gung-ho though. With the fate of the BEF so fresh in their minds, they wondered whether the Sledgehammer wasn't actually going to end up as the Nut, caught in a crushing counterattack by German forces. By July 1942, their uneasiness had prevailed. Pointing to the lack of landing craft, they persuaded the Americans to give up on the idea. Stalin was to get his second front a few months later, but it was to be far to the south, in Africa.